The night wind swept across the lonely valley like a restless spirit, whispering through the dry grass and rattling the loose boards of the small wooden cabin that stood at the edge of the old ranch, a place so far from the nearest town that the stars seemed brighter there, sharper, almost close enough to touch. And inside that quiet cabin, the oil lamp flickered weakly against the walls while Maria stood near the window, her hands trembling slightly as she stared into the darkness outside, because everything in her life had changed in a single day, and she still could not decide whether fate had been cruel or merciful when it brought Daniel Carter to her door. Daniel was known across the territory as a hard man, a quiet rancher with broad shoulders, weathered hands, and eyes that had seen too many winters alone, a man who rarely spoke, but whose presence carried a strange weight, the kind that made people step aside without being asked. Yet tonight, that same man stood only a few feet away from her in the dim light, breathing slowly as though he too were trying to steady the storm inside his chest, and the silence between them was thick with everything neither of them knew how to say. Hours earlier, Maria had been traveling the dusty road with nowhere left to go after losing the small home she once shared with her late husband, a cruel turn of debts and dishonest men forcing her away from the only life she had known. And when the storm rolled across the plains, she had knocked on the first door she saw, expecting rejection the way life had taught her to expect it. Yet Daniel Carter had opened that door and simply stepped aside without asking a single question, letting her enter the warmth of the cabin as though it had always been meant to happen. At first they barely spoke, sharing only a quiet meal and the soft crackle of firewood, while rain battered the roof outside. But loneliness has a way of loosening guarded hearts, and before long, Maria found herself telling pieces of her story while Daniel listened, his deep voice offering only a few careful words in return. Yet those words carried a gentleness she had not expected from a man rumored to be as tough as the desert itself. And slowly, the tension that filled the room shifted into something stranger, something warmer, like two wounded souls realizing they were not quite as alone as they believed. Time passed unnoticed until the storm outside faded into distant thunder, leaving the world hushed and still. And that was when Maria finally turned toward him fully, the lamp casting soft light across her face as emotion shimmered in her eyes, because the truth she had been avoiding all evening had finally reached her heart. She was afraid of being alone again, afraid of stepping back into the cold world beyond that door, where no one waited and no one cared whether she survived another winter. And perhaps Daniel sensed that fear because he stepped closer without hesitation, his boots creaking softly on the wooden floor, his voice dropping to a whisper as if speaking too loudly might break the fragile moment between them. "You don't have to leave tonight," he said, and the sincerity in those few words struck her harder than any speech could have, because it was not pity she heard, but something deeper, a quiet promise that this lonely rancher understood the emptiness she carried inside. Maria looked down for a moment, her fingers twisting together nervously, and when she raised her eyes again, there was both vulnerability and courage in them, the kind that appears only when someone decides to trust another person with the truth of their heart. And the air between them seemed to tighten as Daniel stepped even closer, his presence steady and protective, yet uncertain too, like a man who had forgotten what it felt like to care about someone else's happiness. The words he whispered next came slowly, carefully, as though he feared hurting her in ways deeper than physical pain. And though the moment carried a heavy emotion, neither of them fully understood yet. What mattered most was the tenderness behind his voice, the quiet reassurance that whatever happened next would come from trust rather than desperation. And Maria felt something inside her chest finally begin to soften after years of carrying grief alone. Outside, the wind moved gently through the valley, the storm now only a fading memory, and inside the cabin, the two strangers who had crossed paths by chance found themselves standing closer than either expected when the night began, their hearts beating with that uncertain rhythm of people standing on the edge of a new beginning. Daniel had spent years convincing himself that solitude was easier than love, easier than risking loss again after the tragedies that shaped his past. Yet watching Maria fight the tears in her eyes stirred something buried deep within him, something stubborn and hopeful that refused to remain silent any longer. And he realized that sometimes life places two broken roads together, not to deepen their pain, but to build a stronger path forward. Maria, meanwhile, felt warmth spreading through her chest as she realized that kindness still existed in this harsh world, that perhaps the lonely rancher before her was not just another passing stranger, but the start of a story she never imagined she would live. The cabin felt different now, no longer just a temporary shelter from the storm, but a place where possibility lingered in the air, and the quiet moment they shared carried a promise neither dared to name yet. Hours later, they sat beside the fireplace, speaking more freely than before, laughter occasionally slipping between the serious conversations about the past, and the loneliness that once filled the room slowly dissolved into something comforting, something that felt almost like home. Daniel told stories about the early days of the ranch, about the long winters when snow buried the valley, and he wondered if anyone else in the world remembered he existed. And Maria listened with soft eyes, realizing that the strong man everyone feared had spent years battling his own silent battles. She spoke of her dreams too, the simple ones she had nearly forgotten, planting a garden again, waking to sunlight through a kitchen window, hearing someone's footsteps in the next room, instead of endless silence. And each word seemed to stitch their separate lives together in small but meaningful ways. By the time the fire burned low, the distance between them had disappeared completely, replaced by a quiet understanding that sometimes destiny arrives disguised as an ordinary night, a simple knock on a stranger's door, or a storm that forces two paths to cross when they otherwise never would. And as the first pale hint of dawn crept across the horizon outside the cabin window, Maria looked around the small room and felt something she had not felt in years. Hope. And Daniel, watching her expression soften in the growing light, understood that perhaps this unexpected meeting had given both of them a second chance at the life they thought was lost forever. The valley that once echoed only with wind and silence might soon carry laughter, shared dreams, and the quiet strength of two people choosing to face the future together. And if there was one lesson their story offered to anyone listening, it was that even the darkest nights can lead to the brightest mornings, when courage and kindness meet at exactly the right moment. And if you enjoyed this powerful journey of love, resilience, and unexpected destiny, remember that many more unforgettable stories are waiting to be told. Stories of the Wild West, of lonely hearts finding hope again, and of ordinary people discovering extraordinary strength. So make sure you subscribe to the channel and join us for the next adventure, because the next story might be even more shocking, emotional, and inspiring than this one.